So getting started, basically knowing the CSS concepts. When I was working on Wilbanks Hive, at the same time, Dan had given me a Pluralsight card. And so I went on Pluralsight and realized that I don't really know enough CSS to get this, to get this done right. So I took a training seminar on Pluralsight on CSS and introduced me to some things I had forgotten, reintroduced me some things I had forgotten, and introduced some new concepts. But one of the things to remember about CSS is its cascading inheritance, thus the name cascading style sheet. And it's easy to probably forget that, but if we take a look at a very, very simple HTML page, here we have a body, and in that body we have defined what fonts we're going to use. If I turn that off, of course it's going to turn it off for those, but the whole point of cascading here is I've defined it at the body, and any child elements are inheriting those settings. So not all CSS settings, but a lot of them will cascade down. For example, borders don't cascade down, but something like a font family, when you set the font family at the body, it does cascade down. So if you define new elements, then they pick up text from their parents. So even within this span, we see some text, and you can see it's styled using what was defined in the body. So just the fact that we're cascading down, inheriting our settings from our parent. And Chrome is a really phenomenal tool for working with CSS. We use Chrome more than anything else when we're working on Wilbanks Hive. And you can see over here on the right side how in the styles it shows that I'm getting styles from the body, and then I'm getting my styles from the definition of strong, which actually was set in our CSS, and then all the way down the element style, which if we had one set. So we can see it cascading, and we can see where that comes from by using the Chrome tool. One of the new concepts we utilized was reset CSS. And reading through that Pluralsight training, one of the things that ties into cascading is, well, if we're defining something at the body, what if we didn't define it there? Where do these styles come from? We haven't defined anything here as far as font family. Who says that it should be a serif font with footers, like a Times Roman font? Where does that come from? It has to come from somewhere, right? And it turns out there is what's called, in each browser is defined a user agent style sheet. So every browser defines its own definition of a default style sheet. It's called user agent style sheet. And because browsers can do that slightly differently, you can end up having your HTML display differently in different browsers. That's one reason. There's a lot more reasons, of course, that they're going to display differently in different browsers, but that's one reason, is you might have different defaults that you're working with. And if you haven't defined something and you're using that default, then you get switched between browsers, you're going to end up seeing something different. And it applies quite a bit to margins and padding, ends up defining a lot of that. So what's recommended is to use a reset CSS. So I'm going to show you how we do that. Let's see, just a second, we open up the right page. So we'll take that basic HTML we were showing and use an import directive. And that was a new thing I learned as well, is you can import one style sheet into another. And save that. And now we're going to import this reset CSS. And this was a common one that's used, that was recommended. There's several different types of ones that people have used, but a guy named Eric Meyer came up with this one. And basically it takes all of these tags and says, okay, I'm going to set your margin to 0, your padding to 0, your border to 0, and basically zero out everything instead of using the defaults that the browser is going to give you. And so by importing that in, that helps set us even across different browsers. So
that's kind of have to enforce like a clean slate.
yeah, kind of start with a clean slate. And you can see how the padding and margins changed once we applied that. Because there are defaults in there. And the defaults make sense. I mean, you should have a little bit of padding around, a header one and so forth. But because they can change between browsers, if you just reset them all, then you're going to force yourself to define it for yourself rather than, using the default that the browser's providing. So that was a good best practice ran into. Another concept is and this was kind of eye-opening for me, but the CSS box model. And that means that everything on the page is a box. And I'll show an example of that. So if we just turn borders on, and this is a bunch of divs and LIs and so forth that we outlined, but every single element, all your tags, everything on the page is a box. Even if I was to inspect this element here and go down and look at the metrics on it, I can kind of highlight that box. So that's a box. It's inside of a box, a paragraph that's a box. And we can go through and highlight, but you see basically everything, the body itself is a box. Everything, every element is a box. Even if you drew a circle, it's still a box because you've got it's defined as a box and it's inside of a parent that's a box. So you always are going to have padding and margins. And padding is the space between your content and the edge of your box. So, and this little metrics tool shows that pretty well. Let's see.
Yeah, I just select something.
I got the wrong thing selected. Thank you. So you can go down and inspect and see, okay, where's my padding, if I have any, and border, but because we use the reset CSS, we don't have any defined. But everything has some sort of padding, which is the, if you have it defined, between the content and the edge of the box, and then the margins is between the edge of the box and other elements. So you can set a margin and set your spacing. And using like a margin left, we ended up using that a lot on Wilbanks Hive to position elements.
Yeah, go back to that real quick. That used to be a real pain. I think they fixed it now. But between Mozilla and IE, one of them used to put the border on the outside, and one of them used to put the border on the inside when it got wide. Mm-hmm. So you look at two different pages with the same HTML, and they would look funky in one because you would line it up, assuming the border was on the inside of one or the other. And then you look at the other browser, and your boxes would be, off by a pixel, which didn't bother me. But you get these people that get concerned about things like that.
Sure, you have some clients that
that's off a pixel. I'm like, so you can read the page, can't you? But that used to be real annoying. Now they've got it so the border, I believe, is like that on every browser.
Yeah, more standard.
It's inside from whatever the dimension is inside. So.
And that's a good point to mention browser engines and so forth as well, because basically you have IE, which is Microsoft doing its own thing and is always 2 years behind everybody else. And you got WebKit, which powers Chrome and Firefox, I believe.
And Safari.
Firefox has its own,
Firefox
doesn't it?
has its own.
Has its own, yeah. And then you've got Safari powering Opera. Or is WebKit now?
Yeah, Safari's WebKit. Opera's going to be WebKit here shortly.
Yeah, we'll see a little bit later. There are engine-specific CSS sometimes because you'll have something that's a CSS3 proposed standard, but it hasn't been fully adopted, so they have their own prefixes that you'll use. And Visual Studio helps with filling out what those prefixes are. So we'll see that in a bit as well. But I'm a big Chrome fan, so anything that works with WebKit, I think should work everywhere. That's kind of a biased opinion.
There was a rumor at one point that when they were working on IE10, they were going to go to WebKit as their base engine, but I don't think we did.
No. Unfortunately, that would have been nice. A lot more standards then.
Still try that.
Okay. Another concept here is your CSS selectors. And you guys are probably familiar with W3 Schools, but very first time I ever learned CSS tags and so forth way back when, or XPath, or any of these new things, W3schools.com has a great reference. And you have a lot of different selectors. Your most common ones is a class selector, where in the CSS you put a dot in front of the name, and anywhere you apply that class, of course, it's going to use that. The element selector, where you're just naming the element, and the ID selector, where you're putting a pound sign in front of the name in the style sheet. Those are the most common ones. And then you get into some more sophisticated ones, such as where you have a space between them, and that means it's applying it to children of this element. And then you have the greater than, it's direct children of this element. Comma separated ones, so you apply it to all of them. There's just all kinds of selectors. Selectors are really important because that's how you determine what the style is going to apply to. But also in CSS, it has the notion of which set of styles override which set of styles when you've defined multiple styles. So for example, if you define that divs have a certain border, all your divs will, but if you get down to the ID and you specify for a specific div that it's going to have a different border, then that style definition is more specific than the broader definition that you applied across all divs. So the more specific definitions will override anything that's broader. And Chrome helps with that a lot. We can take a look. I'll pull it up for here. But Chrome shows, on the right-hand side, it shows the more general at the bottom. And as you go up through the styles, it gets to the more specific. So we can see here that I had set font size to 1.0 EMs, but then overrid it to 171% with this more specific style definition. So this was for let me scroll, for that selected LI. So I can turn that off, and that turns it back on here because I just took it off the more specific definition. But so that was kind of handy to know that, to look at it. It's the most specific ones are at the top, and you get the more general ones down towards the bottom. And then the strike through, of course, means that it's been overridden, by a more specific style. So for this one element, we've got let's see how many different style definitions. We have the selected LI class. We have this LI element style. We have those two. We have some here, you can see the user agent style sheet, so we can see some defaults that are coming in. So I'm not using a reset CSS on my personal website, which I should be following my own best practice, but I'm not yet. And then you can see the things defined there at the body. If I had a reset CSS, then those would probably be overridden. The user agent style sheet ones would. Okay. And let's see. Knowing those selectors are really important as you use jQuery as well, because jQuery uses the same selector mechanism to select elements within the HTML page. So it's really the CSS selector approach has become universal. And there are some specific kind of what's called pseudo classes that are really important, such as hover and active. Those become really important. As you hover over something, then that class will come on automatically. So if I take a look at this particular element, we can see that I have a colon hover defined here, and just when I hover over that element does that class become active. Let's see. So you can have your jQuery apply in a similar manner. And what I just learned just this morning, actually, as I was working on this site, I actually had a problem where anytime I would click one of these menu items up here, it was jumping up and getting large, just like these LIs that I'm clicking, because I had this same font size change apply to all LIs throughout the whole entire site. So I'll show you the JavaScript for that real quick. And basically I had this apply whenever we click to change classes, I've removed a class and added a class to get the selected LI on when I clicked it. And but learned this new selector called not. So now you can say, okay, I'm selecting all the LIs, but not these, and put the not selector on there, and then basically any valid CSS selector can go inside the not. So you can say, okay, I'm selecting all of them, but not these.
Now,
And that's kind of handy.
is there a reason you did it like that rather than assigning a class to, say, your tab LIs? Or
I have an ID. There is another way I could have done it, and I have and I do have some classes assigned to those. In fact, I have a pound menu.li, I believe it is, for applying styles to these. In fact, we can look at that real quick. Yeah, here we go. UL pound menu LI. So I do have some specific styles for those specific LI entries. But in what I don't have is I don't have anything specific set up for these guys down here.
For your content.
Those are just general LIs.
Yeah.
You know, so I didn't have a class. Now I could have gone through and defined a class for all of those LIs and just selected those.
okay.
And that would have been, that meant applying that class to every LI that I had on about 8 different pages. And plus I wouldn't have learned how to use the not selector. So, I said, I want to use a not selector. That just seems cool. And I'm like, well, if I can get it to work in CSS, maybe I can get it to work in jQuery, and sure enough. So that was a new one learned there. So it's kind of a nice special selector. So again, the point is learning these selectors is really handy for CSS, but also for jQuery. And responsive web design, this is the concept that no matter what my window size is of my browser, I still want things to display correctly. Because now that we're using mobile phones, you're going to have much different browser aspect ratios and sizes than you would with just a normal desktop. I mean, we were all, before mobile devices, still challenged with, what's our target resolution that we're targeting, and we don't know if it's going to look good at other resolutions, but we're going to make it look good at this one. The idea behind responsive is you're supposed to make it look good at all resolutions. So if your site's targeting mobile devices and so forth. And a site that espouses that really does a really good job of it. And it's a great CSS site called CSS-tricks.com. And this is a good site. They're doing kind of the flat panel styling on their site. I like the way they did their styling. But as far as responsiveness goes, they show you a good example by resizing the browser. You can see I went from that size and had the navigation as one row, and then they broke the navigation down to 2 rows. So you still get the same navigation. Also, you see that third column disappeared. So that third column, they might have moved the content further down the page, or they might have got rid of it altogether. But either way, no matter my browser window size, now I'm assuming like I'd be on a different screen resolution or something here, I'm still getting content that's readable. Instead of showing them everything and basically everything getting smaller if I'm trying to show everything. And then if I break it down even further, and let's say we go down to something that would be more like a mobile phone, then they break it down to just one column, and then the navigation becomes an option up here. So, and then now they're just down to one column. It's going to look much better on a mobile phone than trying to see 3 columns. And you're not going to have teeny tiny font. Now you're going to have something that shows up in a readable size, and then they can have their content just collapse into one long column instead of having 3 columns. So I thought they did a good job of kind of practicing what they preach regarding responsive design. So good example. Okay.
Do you
All
have
right.
an example of what it takes to make that happen?
Of how they did that?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I didn't look into it a whole lot, but one of the key concepts we'll touch on a little bit later in CSS3 is called Flexbox. And there's we'll show an example a little bit later of how they might have done it. I didn't get to research it completely, but there are some CSS3 concepts that support being able to create responsive designs.
Hey Dale, looks an
Yes.
awful lot like they're just using a CSS3 media query to switch the layout of CSS.
Okay. So see, Rob knows knows a lot more CSS probably things than I do, and it'd be good to, yeah.
Probably not more.
I picked his brain some, or different ones.
So what is that?
There's so much to learn. I'll
It
tell you what.
substitutes a completely new style sheet when you get to a certain
Yeah.
aspect ratio?
Yeah. Yeah, it's super handy, really cool.
Yeah,
Okay, so you don't have to dynamically,
But that forces the render, obviously, render records, so it recalculates the entire layout of the page.
Yeah, but if you're dealing with an iPhone or an Android or anything that was built after 2005, you're fine.
Yeah.
It's kind of the point of all that stuff.
So media query, you can select a whole different style sheet based on.
Yeah.
Based on your screen rest.
Awesome.
yeah.
And you don't have
That's
to
been around
select
for a
them.
while though, because I mean, as far as that concept is, they use it for whether you're printing the page or whether you're viewing
Yeah.
the page. But they just take it a step further, and you can specify screen sizes and things like that.
Yeah, I'm going to research how they did that on theirs and see if there's any alternate approaches as well, because that'll be interesting to know if they're using a Flexbox approach or a media query approach.
But I'll tell you another thing that they do to accomplish that too is that you don't use any tables, you use all divs.
Right.
And they do everything with float left. So what happens is as your screen comes over, it just
Yeah.
keeps reflowing your div tags.
Mm-hmm.
That's what HTML is supposed to be, a flow language. This, all these people that want stuff at specific spots on the page kind of defeat the purpose of what HTML was for, but
Yeah.
it's a flow language. And if you follow the flow, using div tags and letting the browser adjust it based on what it's displaying in and let things fall in based on the rules, you can do that.
And you're doing an
that can-
actual flow layout.
Yeah,
not-
yeah, exactly.
And just so everybody's clear, I didn't document this anywhere, but tables are not used for layout. Divs are used for layout. So, in case there's any question. Now, I have used tables for forms sometimes.
but you could
we have
say-
a couple columns,
the-
but
when you
general,
want something
in
that are
general.
specifically
Table.
header and rows.
Sometimes, like a form, you
No.
have a label column. Sometimes
Yeah.
I've done that.
It-
It's a
yeah.
little bit simpler to use a table.
A table
But
is
for a
meant to
general
be
page
used-
layout, it should be divs.
Yeah.
It's definitely not tables.
Yeah.
And that's been a best practice for a long time, but
Yep.
some people still question it. Okay, so the step number 2 we were talking about is prototype your layout. And me and Rob were talking about this a few weeks ago, and Rob says when he goes to prototype site layout, he actually starts with a blank sheet of paper and starts drawing it on a sheet of paper. Or you might whiteboard, something like that, and say, how many columns do I have? How can I break out the layout of the site? So that's definitely a good starting point. One of the things we also needed to do with Worldbank was to have a way to communicate what our prototype is to the client. So we used SharePoint because SharePoint provided PowerPoint, excuse me, one of those points. Wouldn't use SharePoint. No, that'd be bad. But to do some mock-ups. So basically use some graphic tools and to create some graphics and drop them into SharePoint and sent this back and forth with the client and said, how do you like this if we use this up here and this over here, and we had this filter bar on the left, and stole some ideas from Amazon as far as the top section up here with having a filter drop down. Some of those ideas made it into the final product and some didn't. But using PowerPoint as a way to mock things up real simply and share them with the client, and they would use PowerPoint as well to make changes or to come up with their own concepts, send it back, and we'd send them back and forth in emails until we got some good ideas going back and forth and then implemented them in the site. So I'll show you the Worldbank Hive site for some of the folks here that hasn't seen it. Let's see, let me close out the dev tools. And Worldbank Hive is a knowledge base and search engine, essentially, where the World Bank is capturing all of, for here on this page, you're capturing a lot of recent news events and displaying those. So it's a basic news portal. And then the idea map is a search engine approach where They can enter in all the various URLs for all the resources they have on partner sites and World Hive sites and any URL in the world, really, and gather them all together in one place and have a way to search and find things that are resources out throughout the web. So one of the things that they wanted to do something there that was very graphical and not just a textual type of search engine. So thinking of a Google search, you're always getting textual stuff back, and they wanted to have a hierarchy of themes, subjects, and topics, which is how they organize their information. So this highest level here is a theme, and if we drill down into it, we can see the various subjects. When we drill down into those, we can see topics, and if we drill down in the topics, you can see resources that are associated with that topic. And in World Hive, you can have a resource that's associated to multiple topics. So they wanted to do something that was kind of eye-catching and you know, not standard. Some things we talked about were animation, like you were kind of clicking through the galaxy. Some of the other ideas were having an idea map approach where it was very hierarchical, but there was no, in the end, there was really no final conclusion on how the layout of these resources should be. So basically we left it up to the client and said, okay, you guys tell us how you want us to lay those things out. And Gary came up with the concept of what he called a helix curve, where we could he wanted to group his resources by these different topics. So basically all of these resources are associated to this topic, and all of these are associated to this topic, and so forth. And I can click on that topic and reload for that topic. And if I click on a particular resource, I can see that resource URL to it, which is essentially, you know, what you ultimately want to do is, you know, hey, I found one I wanted, now I want to go open this up on whatever site that is and get that information I'm looking for. And then I can come in here and rate the resource. So I remember Joe putting all these little stars in and getting these things to work. It's pretty nice. But I have to sign in actually to authenticate and save some of these things. So we have this functionality that's available to everybody, and then there's certain functionality like ratings you need to be signed in for. But the speed of the loading, I told Joe one time, I said, I just read this article on Byte Magazine's website that World Hive was rated the world's fastest search engine. And he was like, what? He said, for real? I got him, it was funny. But you can see how fast we are loading results, and that's due to the underlying architecture. We ended up using a true multi-tiered architecture where we had back-end WCF services that are hosted on a separate app server. We're calling those from the web server, and then from the client, Marty had this really great concept of using a JavaScript proxy. So you're familiar with using proxies against like a web service. He created a JavaScript proxy on the client side against the backend web service. So you could even be more object-oriented, take that proxy concept down the client side. So anytime we click, what it's doing is it's doing a AJAX request to WCF data services, which is now called Web API. And there's a good alt.net presentation coming up, I believe, next Tuesday. Tuesday on Web API. So looking forward to that. But Web API gives you a REST-based way to, with MVC, to search and pull down AJAX really quickly. And you can see it just, and on the very, very back end in the database, it is where it's actually doing all of the query, you know, I want this specific topic, for example. So you can see that it's just super, super fast. So we were really impressed with that architecture and how quickly it ran. A lot faster than we
Just
expected.
put a little bit more detail in that when every time he's clicking on one of those things, it's really doing 3 hops. because it goes
Yeah, it is.
from the website back to the web server, from the web server through services to the services server, and then from there to the database. And you're seeing all that, and then all the response all the way back as he's clicking on this. So you can still get really good performance when you abstract your layers out and do that.
Yeah, and I'd never took it to that many layers before, and I didn't expect that. I thought with having those hops, it would add a lot of lag, but it didn't turn out to be the case. And of course, then it's more scalable because you've got your app tier and so forth. So
Yeah, you get 2 layers in there where you can scale out and make it more processors available for requests.
And getting back to the CSS part of the discussion, the way we ended up creating this S-curve is actually went into Excel. We had to fix it to 25 results per page, and just went into Excel and actually calculated the curve for 25 results. And then every one of these elements is a specific class. So if we look at so kind of cheated, maybe you could say. But this is S-curve child 5. It has margin left of 350. So there's a S-curve child 6 and 7 and so forth all the way up to 25. And just assign that class to that element. But it provided a lot of flexibility of spacing exactly where we wanted things by just changing the CSS of that left margin and saying, okay, I want the left margin to be out here. So ended up working out.
So after 25, they just drop off, or is there more?
After 25, we go to a view more, and so we start paginating at that point. You should know that. Didn't you fix some bugs with that?
I wasn't for that piece.
Oh, you didn't fix those bugs. Maybe that was me. Okay.
Is the World Bank WCF services like all RESTful, or you have RPC style?
The Hive, the tier that we're calling from the client side to the server is RESTful, and then the other tier, which is from the web server to the app server, that's traditional WCF calls, which are not RESTful style. But we were not able to use MVC4 here. Because it's actually hosted in SharePoint, they wanted to use SharePoint. And we could do a whole lunch and learn on how to create SharePoint apps without using SharePoint.
But nobody would show up.
But I've done it twice. right, exactly. Yeah, no, we'd be there. Because me and Seth have both worked on.
Lunch Dan under what?
That's the second time, and Andrew, in the past we worked on a huge app where we did exactly that. We eliminated SharePoint. And so a lot of those lessons learned tied into World Bank Hive, where we were able to avoid having to mess with SharePoint too much. So it was good there. Okay, so again, the basic concept there is you can prototype and with something like PowerPoint, work it back and forth with the client. And then once you agree on what the basic layout is, how many columns there are, things like that, then you want to create a mock-up and in HTML. So let's see. So let's go take a look at our HTML mock-up here. And the structure of the HTML, of course, is critical. And basically, we know we needed some site navigation across the top, so we have a div for that. And best practice I've seen on most sites now, a lot of the stuff coming from the Microsoft things is when they scaffold your basic MVC sites and stuff, you'll see using ULs and LIs, because there's so much you can do with CSS now to lay it out not vertically but horizontally as well and get spacing exactly the way you want it. So this is what was used for World Bank. And then within the World Bank main body, we have a container div, and within that div, we have all the main sections that we had prototyped. We have the history div that goes across the top, and then the filter, which is kind of that left side column where we could do search and filter, the idea map, which was the body, and then the resource was the one you saw when we drilled all the way down on the right side that had a URL and description about the resource. So by having those divs and just putting let's get the basics into the HTML, and then putting some test content into the divs, we can get a good basis for starting to prototype. And that's where we got halfway through this project, and we were loading Worldbank Hive in different browsers, and it just wasn't laying out correctly when you resize windows and things like that. So we just kind of had to go back to the basics and relay out some of the stuff. So this is what it looks like when you've got all of these divs and we haven't really applied any CSS at all to it. But we have our navigation, which is of course vertical. We need to change it horizontal. And we have these 3 columns here, which are supposed to be horizontal. And so we've got some CSS for that. Let's see. So for the divs and LIs, I'm going to turn on some borders so I can see what things look like and where the borders of things are at. So we can say, okay, now I can kind of see where things are for now. So a temporary setting for that. And then for this navigation, I had a class on it called navigation. Let's see. And see, we have some display as a table cell. That's going to take that list and make it horizontal like it's a row. And then we can define widths and so forth for those. So we'll take a
Table
look
cell
at this.
CSS3.
No, a lot of this is regular CSS, not just CSS3. But you'll notice on my handy dandy site here that things that are CSS3, we put a little CSS3 icon next to them, so you can tell the difference between old CSS and new CSS if you want to. So by applying that display as a table, or what was that directive there? Table cell. Putting some width on there, aligning the text, setting some padding. We got the basics of our navigation across the top. And now we have these other divs that are still vertical and we want them to be horizontal. So let's take a look at those. Remember, we have the container. So the container contains the 3 columns. So we had some basic settings we had to have for that, and then each of those 3 columns have some settings in common that are going to make them horizontal. So we defined a column class that we applied to those. And let's reload this. Okay. So now I've got those guys going horizontal. Of course, they're going like way horizontal, but we put this test content in here on purpose, because if they were just empty, then the 3 of them would show up horizontal right here. They'd be 10 pixels wide or something, and it wouldn't tell you anything. But by filling out a bunch of test content in there, then we can see at different browser resolutions and with different browsers, different browser sizes, how these things reflow. And we can see right now with that test content, of course, they're way, way too wide. So we can fix that. So we have the selectors here for each individual column ID. And for these page-specific selectors like this, it's an ID on a specific page. I might put that in the global, or you might want to put it in a page-level style tag. It works either way. It doesn't matter how you want to organize it. So we're setting the widths to certain percentages, and now we've got it down to their horizontal, and I got basically how wide I want these things to be. So we got some basics there. Basics of our layout going on. Okay. So we defined each area as a div. We filled each div with test content. You want to set your margins and padding, and you want to resize at different browser sizes and see how do these work? Are they is one going to go under the other? That was a big challenge we had. There's certain direct CSS we ended up applying that kept them all being horizontal,
Everything is still,
Yeah.
still set low.
they're still there. It's still horizontal instead of one coming up under the other.
I believe that was the purpose in the table, so.
Yeah, that, let's see, that was probably on the column display inline block. I think this is the one that did it for that particular challenge. Yeah. And then white space, I think we defined white space up here as no wrap on your, up here, so that if we have some white space, like we see on this one here, instead of wrapping and breaking it into two lines, we did a no wrap, whereas we kept it normal in these others. Okay. Let's see. And then testing in different browsers. So you can see how it works. If you're targeting multiple browsers, you can see how that works. Okay, so we're going to move on to knowing your tools. And we'll show some basics of of using Chrome and using Visual Studio. There's a really good site for Google has out there for using all the Chrome tools. Gives you a lot of good information on that. I'll show you some basics there. The one thing I used probably 80% of the time in working with CSS is inspect element. So right click on that inspect element, and it takes you directly to the HTML and shows you all the different styles over here on the right side. And then you can select on different ones if you want to from here, for example. And then you come over here and you can turn off, you get the right one here, turn on and off different attributes. And then you can go in and adjust them. So if that font size is about right, but not exactly right, then I can arrow up and down and adjust that font size to exactly what I want it to be. I can do that with the color as well. I've got this little color selector here. And I can go, I really wanted that color to be more of a hot pink. Yeah, something like that. And you can do that within Chrome. And then if you click here, it takes you to the Sources tab, takes you to the CSS that was loaded, and the changes that you just made are reflected here. So you're seeing the object model essentially in memory, and you can save this. And the amazing thing is it still has your comments. That's something Microsoft doesn't do a good job with, but Google Chrome certainly has.
Can you add elements there?
Yes, you can. Yeah, you can add in new style directives and all sorts of things. You can add elements to your HTML as well. So I can actually go out and save this to, I'm just going to save it to disk here. No particular important place. But you can save it to disk and you can go make more changes on different elements and come back and save it again. And it's going to save it to the same spot. So basically, I'll ask if I want to replace it. So you can do all your CSS changes within Chrome and then go back to Visual Studio if you want to make a few changes there, and it'll say, hey, do you want to reload because you made changes outside of Visual Studio? And it just gives you a real handy way to work with CSS. Okay.
So because you were editing it in the part that was applied to that class.
Yeah, it applied to everything.
Yeah.
Now it's just temporary, so if I reload the page, then I will get back to normal. Here we go. And what I had, because it's going to reload the CSS off the site.
But, yeah, and then the add elements, you do it from that editor, because it seems like I've never been able to successfully do it from the toolbar on the right. Is that true?
Here you can do a new style rule and add new style. Yeah, I had to figure that out for myself, what these little things up here do.
Okay.
But you can click here and add new rule. It's difficult to do if you don't use that.
Okay.
That's true. So that's pretty handy. The computed style gives you what the browser ended up computing for that selected element. So you can see the width and a lot of things maybe you didn't even specify, but the browser ended up computing them. And then so I said, well, that's kind of neat. I hadn't used that before. And then the styles, let me reload it. There we go. And then you have the styles section here, which is extremely handy. where you can get all the way down the element style and apply something new to that particular, just that particular element, if you want to.
Nice, has IntelliSense and everything.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's it. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So there's some IntelliSense features that are in Visual Studio, like full descriptions. We'll see that in a minute, that are helpful, that you don't have in Chrome, but a lot of what Chrome has is nice. Let's see, you can toggle element states. So I can say, do I want the element to be hovered or not hovered, for example. I don't have a hover defined. There we go, focused. And that's handy. And then also a little picker here. There's different types of colors. You can use hex colors or RGB or HSL. And we'll look at that a little bit later. But all of that's available within these tools. And that's just the CSS tools. Of course, there's JavaScript tools and a lot of other things that are helpful as well. Let's see, so the sources, we took a look at that. We can, let's see, you can highlight in the sources and drag it into your Visual Studio editor, or you can just save it out to disk, is what I ended up doing more recently. And you can force element state, which that's really nice to be able to do. Let's see, so let's take a look. We'll look at this guy. I'll inspect that element. And I can go to that element, right click on it, and say force element state to hover, and it will turn green, even though I'm not really hovering over it. And it will show you because until I figured out how to do that, it was always a pain to work with the pseudo classes like hover, because you don't normally, without that, you don't normally have access to them, because you can't hover over it and look at the tool at the same time.
Mouse option.
Yeah.
One to hover.
So see, you don't see the hover style. If you go to inspect the element, you don't see the hover style. And so we can force it here and see it, which is handy, or you can just right click on there and force it. But now you can say, aha, there's my hover style, and now I can go in here and I can change it to, whatever color I wanted to or whatever. So it's kind of handy. There we go. Okay. Let's see, so Visual Studio 2012. Let's see, Scott Hanselman has a video here, and it's only a couple minutes long. Well, it's 4 minutes long. Maybe it's a little bit too long for us. I think we can handle 4 minutes. I'll show you there.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. I want to take a moment to talk to you about some of the new features in Visual Studio 2012 and ASP.NET. Right now, specifically the new CSS editor. It's all new, lots of great new features and a number of really cool improvements that I think you'll appreciate. Let me just run into Visual Studio here. I'll open up a CSS file. We've got CSS snippets. So for example, I could create a rule here for an image hover, and then type in transform, tab. From here I could say rotate. Notice that I'm getting IntelliSense and help for rotate. Negative 90 degrees, enter. And I'm automatically generating cross-browser CSS, handling all of the major vendors, Mozilla, Microsoft, Opera, and WebKit. There's snippets for things like media queries, some of the more complicated things that you don't want to have to write yourself. Font face embedding for cross-browser fonts. There's also a brand new color picker. I could change the color of something here. Let's say I just typed color space. I've got all of these CSS colors, but I can also hit hash. And we automatically populate a new palette. Rather than getting IntelliSense, I've got a color palette with all the colors that are located inside my document, as well as the primary colors. I can pull this down, and the color picker gives me all the colors that are available to me, even new in CSS3, transparency and color. If there's a specific color that I want to get, I could click on the color picker, find that picker on my screen somewhere, and pick it, and then hit enter. Also new in the CSS editor is hierarchical indentation. So I could create header H1, header H1 hover. Notice I'm getting IntelliSense every step of the way. And as soon as I close the curly brace, I'm automatically getting indentation that illustrates the cascading rules. This
Okay, so that's the gist of it. But I think the same amount of time, he showed you what I was going to show you, so we'll show Hansel and stuff. One of the main helpful things with certainly is IntelliSense. So if was to type in something like that, and then gives you really nice IntelliSense, a lot more than it did in the past, of what each of these are for, what this does. So that's very helpful. Another nice thing it has, this may not be new to 2012, but is code regions. And I think I had one defined up here. But you can define a region within your CSS and collapse that down with a region and in region. So that's very helpful to have. And one other thing that you don't want to do, but I'll show you anyway, is build style. So I'll show you why. Now, back when I first started working with CSS, 10, 15 years ago, I used to use this all the time. But if I do a build style, it gives me this thing that's been in Visual Studio for a long time, of going in and picking different styles and all this different stuff. And but let's see if I go in and change something and set the font size, for example, and click OK. Then it didn't do it this time, but I've had it blow out the comments when I was testing. I don't ever use it, but I've seen it blow out comments when I was just poking around with it. So that can be a tricky tool. Just use with caution, I would say on that. Okay, so let's see, and then one other tool that's completely useless is, so far at least, is Blend for Visual Studio. So I looked at that and I said, well, maybe it's got some really nice CSS because it had this IntelliSense stuff it was showing. But then when I figured out that Visual Studio 2012 has the exact same thing, then it really didn't add anything. But I thought it was interesting that that Blend does install alongside Visual Studio 2012. So if you're using XAML or something, it's probably pretty handy for that. But it doesn't really add anything for CSS or HTML from what I can tell.
In the last couple of weeks, Visual Studio, the latest service pack, now supports live preview with the MVC. Probably also static HTML files, but I mean, literally, you can tell it, I want to do a live preview with Chrome, and it'll do a split screen, so you can actually preview. And you can actually click on it and it'll actually go to the actual partial control that was actually used to actually build it.
That sounds pretty helpful. It also has sketch flow, I think, in it as well. Blend does, and that's pretty handy. Okay, I'll look for that. I haven't loaded any service packs since I was prepping for this lunch and learn because I didn't want to blow anything up. But that's pretty cool. Okay, determining graphics and color schemes. For Worldbank Hive, we actually had the graphics provided for us by a graphics designer, which is good because we're not graphics designers. But to show you how we work with that, so they gave us a bunch of icon graphics and so forth, and he also gave us these color swatches. So these became the color themes, essentially. And to determine, but they didn't give us what the hex value was for each of those colors. It'd be nice if they had, but since they didn't, using my handy dandy paint.net is typically the graphics tool I've used, and using your color picker to go in and say, okay, what's that one? And click on more, and then in paint.net it gives you the hex value. So we would then take those hex values for each of those and put those at the top of the CSS file. So let's see. Let's see if there's changes. So let's take a look at that. So we just put those hex values at the top of the file and said, hey, whatever we're using orange, it's this, and so forth. Now there
So
are.
is that just a comment reference, or does that actually say now when you say orange down in your style?
No, it's just a comment.
Okay.
Yeah, because CSS doesn't support variables
Okay.
like that. However, CSS preprocessors do, like less and SAS.
Yeah. Okay.
And we could have tried using one of those with Worldbank Hive, but I wanted to make sure we were using CSS right first
Yeah.
before we got into the preprocessor stuff. So that's the next step for me, really, is to start to use the preprocessors. And I know Matt Duffield has used those a good bit. I think he actually did some lunch and
The
learns
latest
and stuff on it.
MVC stuff in Visual Studio 2012 has the less stuff built.
Oh, built into it?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
There's
Well, that's
another
becoming the
more
standard.
pure
now.
CSS way of doing it that doesn't involve preprocessors. I can explain afterwards.
Oh, okay.
Kind of lengthy.
Okay, that'd be neat. All right. Okay, so that was, so you got to have some well-defined icons and graphics and things like that, of course. And we're just going to show you some of the icons. I have a content folder. As far as a way of organizing the site, I've gotten in the habit of, instead, we used to always create an images folder. I now create a content folder, and then under that put images, and then you might have videos, you might have fonts, you might have other different types of content for the site. And within that I had icons. So we've got these icons from a graphics designer as well. And that's the icons we end up seeing on the site, and I think I could show some of those there. So we ended up using those icons on the site. And this background graphic originally was a black graphic with gold hexes in it, this honeycomb pattern. And with a good bit of research and trial and error, figured out how to reverse all the colors and make it look really right using paint.net so that we could have a white background. And that's what the color scheme we ended up going with. And let's see here. Let me get back to where we were on here. So your background graphics, CSS3 has the ability to provide gradients. So you can actually, I don't have an example here, but you can provide, I want to start with dark blue up here and light blue down here. I can define that as my background gradient. And this course for this site is just a standard background graphic. And I've got this awesome trick for how you handle a non-repeating background. I taught myself, but I'm not going to show that right now. Anybody wants to hang around, I can show you how to do that. But basically the problem was this background graphic eventually is going to end, and it kind of stutter stepped when it repeated itself, and found a way to fix that. Opacity is used to allow a background through an element. We use that on Worldbank Hive. You can see these graphics here. We set the opacity on the element so it didn't completely show the entire element and just allowed some of the background through. So you can see opacity set to 0.4, and we can adjust that value, and you can see the full entire graphic or adjust it down. And then when you hovered over it, actually adjusted the opacity a little bit on that. So that's a nice CSS3 rule to use. RGBA, that was new when we learned alpha transparency. That's pretty neat. Let me show, let's see. We'll show how we use that here on the graphics and color schemes. RGBA is a CSS3 directive, and let's see, here we go. So instead of providing hex as a color, you can provide the 3 RGB components. You can also provide the HSL, which is hue, saturation, and whatever the L stands for. Lightness. Thank you. And it uses a V in paint.net for some reason. But it's HSL is the standard, so it's lightness, and you can specify. So hex values may make a lot of sense to your CPU, but as a designer, somebody who's a designer specifying a color, the HSV values make a lot more sense. RGB is a little bit simpler, and RGBA allows us to specify a alpha, so the transparency of the color. So I'm going to comment out, let's see, comment that out and specify a 0.2 for this border color. And we can see the border colors using RGBA. And if you're adjusting your grayscale or how light or dark you want the element to be, that comes in pretty handy.
So is transparency similar to opacity?
Yeah, it is.
Is it the same thing? Okay.
They're actually opposite.
But here we're specifying it as a property of the color. Yeah, that opacity was applied to a graphic, and here this alpha is the opacity for a color,
Okay.
essentially.
Okay.
So we can change. So we can change that there, and we can make it. My mouse will work for me. I can go in and change it to 100%, or I can tweak it to 50% or 20%, and you can see the lightness or darkness of the color changing without having to change the RGB values.
Okay.
So that's really handy when you've got a specific color that you like, but you just want to make it lighter. And
Which I guess that worked because you had a white background, the World Bank. If you had like a black background.
I don't know. We could challenge us to find out.
If you had a black background, you would use the
Go to
white
body
border
and set the
all
background.
opacity.
Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah,
saying.
that'd work. And using the RGBA, it's also really important to remember that RGB
I think we defaulted back
use a
then.
byte value, so 0 to 255,
Mhm.
but the A has to use a decimal between 0 and 1. That maps to, it's basically a percentage, so 0.5 is 50%,
Mhm.
1 is 100%, it's scaled back. But yeah, I tried.
Yeah, because everything was black, right?
Yeah.
So there's your answer. With a black background.
Make it
Got lots of
0,
fingerprints in their
0.
background too.
Right. So with a black background, yeah, this black be bleeding through, so it's not changing anything.
Yeah, so why
We can go to our color picker here, then pick a color. Let's
See a little bit now. Change your opacity.
There. And let's change the opacity on it. Okay, now let's go back up. So if we take it down, so the black's coming through again.
It's a Tron one.
Yeah, yeah, that's what it looks like. That's a good. That looks pretty good.
Depends on who your audience is.
All right. Okay, so that's RGBA. So RGBA pretty handy. HSL, another way to do, also has alpha transparency, and so that can be pretty handy. Okay, so move on from graphics and color schemes, which was 4 to step 5, creating maintainable CSS. And there are no hard and fast rules around creating maintainable CSS. CSS lets you specify anything. You can put all the styles for an entire site in one file, and you can put them in any order almost in the file you want to. There's no hard and fast rules, so it's easy to end up with a bunch of stuff spread out all over the place. So having some conventions could be handy to keep yourself organized. One of the things that Rob had mentioned he liked to do is put the site layout in one file and the site style in a separate file, so that colors and things like that are all in one file separate from layout. Because the tricky thing about CSS is you have all this layout stuff about, you know, I'm floating a div to the left, and I'm setting the margins and padding, and a lot of things that control the position of elements, not just the style. So you've got both positioning and style within CSS, and it can be difficult to keep them separate. So having them in separate files, if you're that disciplined, if we're as disciplined as Rob is.
I start out that way. Usually mutates into something.
I don't know if I'm that disciplined. Haven't tried it.
The only place where they cross over and gets ugly when you start talking about font sizes.
Yeah.
Because the size of your font can
Vary
alter
depending
your
on the
layout.
font. Yeah.
So you have your layout in one and your styles in the other. I consider a font part of the style, not
Right.
part of the layout, but they can
and then it can throw
Affect
things
each
off.
other, yeah.
The
Yeah.
main reason I separate those when I'm setting something up from scratch is so that I can define different layout.css for, say, an iPhone
Yep.
or an Android or an iPad or a desktop or what have you. I've thought about, but I haven't run into a situation where I've needed to create different typography.css. But I've seen the potential need for it for exactly what Marty said. You don't want to use a 72-point font type on an iPhone, or you're going to be reading 1 or 2 letters at a time.
Yeah.
But it's perfectly all right to use a 72-point font, or a 72-point font on, say, a big TV like that, where they'll still only be an inch tall.
You know, there's so many different ways to define font sizes and things. There's proportional and there's pixel and there's percentage and is there a general rule of thumb of what you use when and
The
or what you
hipsters are
prefer?
trending towards EM.
Yeah, the EM, the proportional.
The EM's what I've been told by
Yeah.
the graphical people that do it all the time, as they say.
It's just that EM is it compounds. So if you have a
It does,
proportional that's
yeah.
proportional, you end up with a
You have to calculate it out. There's a new.
0.04.
There's a fix for that. There's a new type of EM that's coming out that fixes that.
Oh, is that
I
right?
read about that. I don't remember the exact name of it now, but there is a way that's fixing it. What's it called? REM. Thank you. REM, like the band, right? Relative EMs.
Now
Yeah.
there you go.
Okay. Cool. I'm glad Seth knew that. So yeah, it fixes the
so
compound
relative
problem.
EM would do what it currently does now, and then the other one is proportional.
Yeah, it solves that problem you're talking about, there,
Figure
keeping
it
it
out.
relative, yeah. Two main ways that, there's two different concepts for defining styles. The more classic concept I always think of is, okay, I want all my H1s to look a certain way, all my tags or all my buttons, and that's an example we'll see, to look a certain way. So you say, okay, I want rounded corners, so for my button tag I'm going to define rounded corners. But I also wanted rounded corners on my divs and shadowed, for example, on my divs as well as my buttons. So I'm really repeating myself if I define it in both places, right? And so a different alternate approach is you could define a style called rounded corners as a class, and then everywhere you have a button, you define that, you add that class to that particular element. And then all the divs that you want to have rounded corners, you apply that class to that element. So you end up with a lot of different elements having this rounded corner class applied to it so that you're not repeating the definition of a rounded corner in your style sheet. And that's one approach some people take. And in Worldbank Hive, we use that in some cases. Like for column, for example, we had 3 different columns, and all 3 of those columns should have the same set of styles. The same CSS, so we defined that class and applied it to each of them. But for something like rounded corners, I wasn't comfortable having to apply a rounded corner class to every button every time we defined it anywhere in the HTML. So instead, and we'll see this in a little bit, we just repeated this and said, okay, this border radius attribute, this style definition, we're just going to apply it to divs and certain classes here. We're going to apply it in multiple different places in the CSS where we want to have. So we repeated shadows and we repeated rounded corners in different places in the CSS so that we wouldn't have to repeat applying something like a class called rounded corners to different elements. This is where the need for a preprocessor like Lesk really comes into play, is to making this more maintainable. It's my understanding of it. Now, I haven't used it. Maybe Rob has. I don't know.
No, I disagree with the whole concept of compiling content for the
Yep.
web.
But anyway,
Besides, like,
that's what Lesk is supposed to do, though, is it gives you variables for things like colors, and it gives you an ability to
Well, you know, the other thing
Combine
you can,
classes.
to combine classes, have true like object-oriented style inheritance, so one class can derive from another. So then I could say my divs derive from shadowed class, so they can all be shadowed. My buttons derive from shadowed class, so they'll all be shadowed, and I don't have to repeat these directives.
well, the other thing you
But
can do
that's-
too, that it's still kind of a management thing to know you're doing that, but if you have, you want rounded corners for something, but you also want a button class to have the same radius, you just put both classes on this definition. So you only have the
Yep.
statement border radius 12 pixels in one place, and you put
And you
both
put
classes
multiple
up there.
definitions. Yeah,
And then
that's a
if you
good
want to go
solution
change the
too.
radius, you only have to change it there, and it changes it for all 3 of those classes.
Yep.
And you can-
Yeah, that's a real good point.
I do
That
that
would have been
with-
a better way to organize
The
that.
way I do that, where I use that, I don't use that for everything, but where I use that is for colors. I define a color once, and I'll put all my classes that color affects on it. And then if I want to go change that color to something else, I don't have to go search for all the classes where I define the color. I just change the one color.
You can also do
Well,
that
that's
to
a-
jQuery
that's-
as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now that approach works really, really well, but where it does fall down is in the actual design. If you've got a 15 pixel radius on a button and it's nested within a larger div or a larger div, as your divs get larger that have the rounded corners, you also want to increase the radius to maintain
Well, yeah,
visual appeal.
yeah.
So using just a strict 15 pixel radius on everything is going to make things actually look kind of like the old school Windows 3.1 buttons, and
Yeah.
where everything had the exact same radius and it didn't scale. It just
No, I'm
looks
not,
bad.
I'm not saying force everything in the same radius. I'm just
Yeah.
saying if you're going to reuse the same
Yeah,
styles all the time,
yeah,
then put multiple classes on there so you're only maintaining that in one
yeah.
place.
Okay. Yeah, that's a real good tip. I should have thought of that. I appreciate you pointing it out.
And that's how jQuery adds classes now, too, right?
What's that?
When you, in jQuery, when you add classes, then when you look at what's rendered, it shows the.
Well, no, there's 2 different things. I'm talking about inside your style sheet, like after that dot column, or any one of those, I can put a comma dot some other class and have it do the same styles. But then also on my div tag, I can do class, and then I can do class equals, and I can do class space, another class space, another class.
Yeah.
Both things, I use both of those things. They're both powerful. But in here, though, if in your style sheet itself, not in the HTML, but in your style sheet itself, if you have a color palette you're using and you want multiple things to be defined with a background color of blue,
Oh, yeah.
you can put in your parenthesis, you put the background color of blue, you can list, comma delimit, and list all your styles that,
Yeah.
and that, your class can show up in multiple definitions. We as
Yeah,
programmers,
that's-
we as
that's similar
programmers
to
think,
everything.
oh, I'm defining the class, so everything inside these parentheses
Needs
is
to be
everything
right
for
there.
that class, which is not true.
Yeah.
Because it's cascading, I can decide, I can put that class on this color definition, I can put that same class name on a layout somewhere, and that same class name on a
Right.
font somewhere, and they'll all work because they're not overriding each other.
Yeah, it's like partial
Yeah,
classes.
it's like a partial class type thing.
Yeah, going wild. Yeah.
Yeah. See, I get caught up in that too, and that's why I'm not good at CSS. Is 'cause I think of that class definition as an object, and all my stuff has to be in there. But it doesn't. In CSS, it doesn't. You can have that dot column appear on multiple definitions,
Mhm.
and as long as they're not all saying the same, they're not all color, they'll all get aggregated together as part of that class.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm gonna update my presentation to add that. That's a real good point, especially.
But I guess HTML for quite a while now has been able to do like on the div tag where you specify a class, you've been able to list multiple classes.
Yes.
But it didn't
Yep.
really become popular until jQuery became popular. You're like, oh yeah, you just do this. But that is a real powerful thing too, because then you can actually on your div tag apply a class that's for layout and a class that's for style on your div tag, so you can specifically see what classes were applied instead of trying to put them all in one definition back in the CSS.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and we're seeing more and more of that too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so we got 2 more steps to go. We've been through 5 of them. And step 6 is defining more of the specific styles. So now we got our graphics, our color scheme defined, and we have our layout defined in the different divs, and I've just reduced it down to just primary one here, one div in the container. And then we wanted to see, well, how are we going to define, some of our navigation and backgrounds. And the objective from a stylistic perspective we were going for here was making this look kind of like a real world thing, as if you were looking at let's say a surface, and you had these 3D panels coming up off of the surface. And that's that's what some of the shadowing and so forth provides. And then when we have a button, that the button actually comes out at you and dares you to click on it. You know, Steve Jobs had a pretty famous quote. He said, "We're going to make our buttons look so good that you want to lick them." That's always kind of stuck with me. So when I went to defining buttons for Wilbanks Hive, that's what I said. I want to make them that good, you know. Except I changed it. We want to make our buttons look so good that you want to click them instead of licking the button. In any case. So basically, just going to uncomment some CSS. We ended up applying there. So for the navigation, we defined some navigation on, navigation off classes, and some hover states and active states. So let's refresh this here. And basically you have 4 basic states for an item. You have, you know, nothing's happening with it. You've got I'm hovering it. You've got I'm active, which means I've clicked it. So you can see we got kind of a click look to it there. And you can see we're using rounded corners and shadows. And then you have the fact that you've actually selected it, which I've always had to go to. At that point, that's where I'm using jQuery to change the class of that element. I haven't found a way yet in CSS to do that. I think it's where you have to go to the JavaScript. But now we've got kind of what we were looking for in a 3D sense, for at least for those menu items.
Only an anchor tag, and you have visited. Is that right?
You can have visited, but that's a pretty nebulous thing.
Yeah.
Can be. Yeah, because visited will show up for like the next 90 days or something. If you've ever visited, depends on your browser settings. If you've ever visited that, your privacy settings, things like that. Okay, so we got some nice stuff going on there. And let's see. And then we had defined a Hive panel. So this was a fairly core class for our CSS. And this is anytime we wanted a div to show up with the rounded corners and the shadows, then let's see. Where did I lose my comment there?
Yeah, less than one of those.
Must have selected something. I didn't mean to. Just a second. Here we go.
You pound it there by your end reading.
The end region up above got uncommented. Right above it.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm just going to undo all this. Something weird happened. It's not a draw. Okay.
Go back one more. Just go look up.
Yeah. There we go. So maybe if I put an extra blank line in there, it won't blow up. Okay. Here we go. So Hive panel, where we're defining what a panel looks like in our site. And a panel was just any of those divs. Let's see. Maybe I didn't see the changes. Let's see.
You got some. There's
You
a
still
little
got
error after
formatting.
the.
Go back to your CSS. You still have a problem.
I must be. Yeah.
Yeah, go up.
See the
See the
end
red
Aha,
squiggly?
there it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
That's why it's not applying. Ah,
It's trying to help you.
yeah.
I wish it was just a little bit smarter. There's text to the right of this. I want the comment. And
Yeah.
and the div tag stuff and all that, when you do a div,
Make
it
sure
does
that's
the closing div like right next to where you're
Yeah.
at. I'm like, well, there's stuff there. Please go to the end of the line. Don't fix it from there.
That's what happens when you reuse the Clippy code.
You see that you're trying to do something productive.
Yeah. Let me
Slow
help.
you down.
You have Clippy hop out your IntelliSense there. Let me help. I gotta help. IntelliClippy. All right. So the Hive panel give us this shadowed and rounded corners and anywhere we wanted to use that panel kind of approach. So having the panel here and the panel here. You notice also that we're using the alpha transparency, the opacity, to let the background blend through a little bit as well on some of these also.
Is there a gradient on the transpac or the opacity for the background? How'd you get the hive to fade out?
Let's see, that was part of the image. That was, yeah, going from left to right like that.
Yeah.
That was part of the image that was provided to us. They had already done that. I don't know if I would have thought of that, but it ended up looking good.
Opacity and do the same thing, I don't know.
Okay.
CSS gradients are in Cal.
Or what?
So let's see. Well, we've got a. Let's hope it doesn't. Uncommenting doesn't kill us again. Let's see. And we will uncomment a whole bunch more here. And we've got these swarm classes, and this is what we're applying to those graphical elements that are in the idea map. And now, when we reload this, these things should all straighten themselves out. Let's see. Oops, I hit the wrong button. There we go. So now we have positioning, and we're using some absolute positioning for this particular layout, for this page, in order to get this curve going on here that they wanted. And this is one of the things that Matt actually worked on early on when this was Canvas, and calculated the curve out. So we were still using that, but now with
Does it pay attention to
HTML.
the media, or the width of the screen?
Now we have it fixed to a certain pixel position because at this point,
Well, it looks good.
yeah, it turned out okay. We got everything but our button here, and we just still got the plain old button. And what I ended up doing for that was spent one Saturday evening researching button building CSS sites, and ended up finding a site that could help me design the button. I didn't get a chance to look up what that site was, but there's a bunch of those sites out there. Found a whole lot of them that you can go, and they'll design the button and show you the CSS, and you just copy the CSS and paste it in, and then modify it and tweak it. So that's and gives you some nice cross-browser settings and so forth. So we ended up with a lot of button stuff. One of the selectors we see here is the attribute selector, the square brackets. So we can define a button as being enabled or disabled, and what they would look like if they're enabled versus disabled. So let's take a look at our button and refresh that. Then we got our nice lickable button, and on our hover over, we're kind of jumping out at you with the button. And then when I click it, it looks like we actually physically click the button. And I'm going to go in and add a disabled attribute to its HTML. And that's a nice HTML5 tag. I'm not real familiar with HTML5 yet, but the button tag, I do like that because it gives you a simple way to define buttons without having to put all the input stuff in there. And let's see. So now we have it defined as disabled. Now it's all grayed out, and it doesn't do anything when we click on it. So, so in that CSS, we were able to define how it looks when it's disabled versus when it's not, hover over, active, all the different selectors for that.
What's that not important in there?
Let's see.
Not important?
It's like an exclamation.
It looks like a not, but it really means it's important.
No.
Yeah, in C language it would be not important, but it actually means important. And what that means is it overrides. It's not a best practice to use it, I wouldn't suppose, but in this case we wanted to override any more specific settings of this color. So there might be a more specific setting, like we were seeing before. The more specific it is, it overrides the more general.
It's equivalent to removing
So-
virtual property, like in other words, forcing it to be sealed.
It's like
Yeah, so we're forcing that.
Frustrating because if you had
Yeah.
a button that you wanted to be red and you went right to the button, said style color equals red, it still wouldn't be red.
Yeah,
Because of this.
it's true,
So it
because
gets
this will
really
override
frustrating.
things that are more
Yeah.
specific.
Oh, there's an important over
Yeah.
here in this other style sheet. All the
Yeah.
time.
Right.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have those collisions, and that's what that was for.
On that button.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Then you can make it more important than ever.
Yeah.
Even more important.
Yeah, yeah, really. I'm really important. Okay, but that's what that ends up being for. And going forward, I'd probably avoid coming up with ways to avoid using it if I could, but it's there if we need it.
When the spec changes a lot, sometimes you just have to make it work.
Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, there's my note to myself to add the URL to the button builder, which I forgot to do. But there's a lot of good button builder sites out there. And then, so that was the basics of the how we created World Bank Hive CSS. And so going beyond that, what else does CSS3 bring that we haven't used yet? We wanted to look at some animation and some more advanced things. So we maybe have another 15 minutes here to wrap this up.
You know, it just occurred to me that curve looks like the elements are orbiting that thing rather than just a 2D curve. It looks like a 3D.
It is. Yeah, it's some sort of a formula that Matt came up with and calculated. Some sort of ellipses thing he spent some time on figuring it out.
Maybe if you could animate it so the things come in and orbit the hive to begin with and then stop.
That would be cool. All right, so some things that CSS3 brings. The classic age-old problem of every other row should be a different color in a table. There's now a selector for that. So it's the nth child. And if we actually inspect that, we'll see, you can actually see that in the rules. If I look at the TR, yeah. And if I can find it, but there we go. Yeah, so nth child is odd, so the even rows won't have this applied to it, but the odd rows will. So you can define your background colors with CSS and you never have to write that code ever again. Unless you're targeting certain browsers. Font face. So this is one a lot of the designers like a lot, but now you can define a font and actually download it. So I'm going to show you what that, how simple that is. So we'll go to our CSS and let's see. I wish it would collapse all those sections for me. I'm going to find a way to do that. But you can define a font face using this @ sign. I'm going to have to go look up and see what the @ sign means now. It must mean, because it's like a preprocessor directive sign or something like that, right? But some of these new CSS3 things start with the @ sign, and font face is one of them. And so you can define give it a name, a brand new font family, and the URL of the font. And certain browsers work with certain fonts, like IE won't work with certain types of fonts and things, but TrueType seems to be a fairly universal one. And so we'll save that. And I'm actually going to download the font off of a different site, which I thought might give me a security error, but hasn't. And let me see. So there we got a completely different font that was downloaded off of some third-party site.
You think you should stay away from those fonts? Or
Well, it gives you the ability to use them now, so I think it depends on your browser support.
so like when all of our clients, would it be likely their firewalls and things would let them use it, or?
Yeah, that's a good. Well, if it's coming from your
Second,
site, it should. You could put it under your content folder.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's I wouldn't ever go to normally pull one from a third-party site. I would copy the font and put it on my own site and
Yeah,
pull
you
it down.
put TrueType font in your
Yeah.
resources on your website, so
Good
it's
idea.
going
Right.
back to the same server.
But that becomes another reason to use a content folder, because then you put fonts,
Yeah.
under your content folder. Put your fonts in there.
You're gonna see that used a lot more.
Yeah.
You know, when a company creates a specific font for their brand,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and then they want to use that for headers.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're not used to doing it, but now.
How big are those fonts if you download them?
Some are tiny, some
Pretty small.
30, 40K.
They're vector font.
Yeah,
TrueType
that's
for vector fonts.
that
so
one
they're
there
usually pretty
is a
small.
93.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
tiny.
Smaller than most images.
Yeah, if it was a PostScript font, it might be massive, but
Yeah.
it's probably what you wouldn't be using it for a web font anyway. So that's one of the new things CSS3 brings that a lot of designers are pretty excited about. Starting to see a lot more of probably. CSS sprites. This is an interesting concept if you're really into high-speed downloading for your site. You have like a lot of little graphics. I'm going to just show you how CSS Tricks had a nice little demonstration of that. So typically, let's say you have all these little menu items, icons, and you're specifying each one separately. So you've got 10 different HTTP requests just to download this, is what they were showing up there. But if you put all of those graphics into one graphic, and then you can specify with this background position, you can say, okay, use this certain region of the graphic and display just that region of the graphic. Then you just download the graphic one time. It turns it into one
So
request.
show one of the sprites
they've done
has a
that
whole bunch of icons.
It's been around for a while though.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I've seen this used before.
Why is that so good?
Because you just
There's only
download
one
You
one
just
image.
have to pull it down one time.
Download one image, and what you're doing in your style sheet is saying show this part of the image for here and this part of the image here.
So
You're creating
overhead's
multiple
more
requests for
HTTP.
every.
It's a lot less trips. Here
Yeah, so
you're
you just
making 10
download one
requests,
image there.
and here you're only making one. And as the speed that we need expect on mobile devices, using mobile connections, this can become more and more important for those kinds of
With
things.
these small images, the overhead of the HTTP protocol is actually larger than the actual image itself.
I was going to say, larger images this wouldn't be beneficial. It's for the smaller ones.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, they did some comparisons on here too. And there's some sites out there for building sprites.
I was gonna
that help
say,
you, yeah, bust
Sounds
them
to
up
me
into
like,
pieces.
I
and so
agree
forth.
with this statement, sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah. Sprite Me, apparently that's a site for building sprites. Make it simple.
Yeah, but there's some places where you get the sprite, and they also give you all the locations for each individual one, and you just pop it into your sheet.
Okay. And let's see, I'm going to show you something real quick here called Flexbox. Flexbox is a layout mode. It is new CSS3, and a lot of the challenges with using divs and so forth is like using floats. Floats weren't really designed for layouts. Floats were designed for floating text around graphics and so forth. So the Flexbox model is trying to bring us a new model that does a lot more of this window resizing and automatically positioning your boxes for you. So I'm just going to pull up some sample HTML that I got off the Mozilla site. But they're using the Flexbox model here. So if you had a header and you had the 3 columns and you reduce the size down, then it does the automatic repositioning of your columns for you without you having to use fancy workarounds and so forth.
What are the elements in there? Are they still divs or?
Yeah, these are all still divs.
Those look like HTML5 semantic blocks.
But let's
Yeah, they're using
see.
article
They're using the
aside.
But yeah, it's just basic HTML.
Header, div, footer.
Those are
yeah.
HTML5 tags.
Okay.
But using the CSS to control how that reflow of different divs works. So I didn't get to spend a whole lot of time.
New tags is to help screen readers pretty much, like for visually impaired people, right? And that's the whole point.
That, and it really helps you think about your site layout. I almost want to say more object-oriented or more semantically, because you don't want to put your main news article in your header. You don't want to put articles in your menu, stuff like that. It's really just a way of,
Unless you're trying to throw off screen scrapers.
yeah, it's a way of getting your brain around some of these layout problems that,
Yeah.
some of us may not be as good at.
And it also is supposed to be helping the semantic web, so if some automated bot's doing your pages, they know
Right.
where the true article is.
What
and they're not
the
searching
title of the
for it.
article is, and who the author is, and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
To pick out.
So
So,
it's
a lot
like
of
the equivalent of the
semantics.
HTTP headers, or the headers inside the head of the body.
Yeah.
Those 6,000 different headers that put in there.
Ish.
So to me, CSS3 brings a lot of stuff that A lot of people just think HTML5, but it's really hand in hand, a lot of that stuff. And Mozilla has a really good page on Flexbox that a lot of different sites cited. But basically, you're just using the display attribute, specifying flex or inline flex for it. So it's something to look into as we move forward. It says like media queries, another one that is solving some of those problems as well. So transition. So we get into some of this animation stuff's pretty neat. So transitions affects it lets an element gradually change from one style to another. So I'm going to comment this back out. And we're going to add to our swarm heading hover class, which is those elements down in the idea map. We're going to add a transition of 1 second. And what this means is for all of the styles that are applying to this class, and I'm applying this to hover, when I hover over it, instead of applying all the styles at once, do it over a second. Transition from whatever state you're in to the new state, and the browser kind of interprets what that transition is, but it can give you a nice little effect. So, and this gets to where we're kind of replacing some of the things you used to do with plugins and Flash and that kind of stuff. Some of these effects do.
Yeah, you don't want to fire up Flash just so you have a transition.
That is nice.
Yeah, it is.
So it just gives you, it's a subtle little effect.
Mm-hmm.
By doing it, I defined it to take 1 second. And it's just one line of CSS. And one browser might show that a little differently than another browser, but the thing is you do get kind of a nice blending effect there.
Now, Dale, with these transitions, can you specify a speed for application and a different speed for unapplying it, or does it just kind of use the same?
It does have easing functions you can apply
Okay.
for how quickly, like a curve and things like that.
Okay.
I haven't got into that, but there are things like that you can apply. So I'm going to take that back off and show you a few other transforms. So there are a lot of different transforms. These are the basic ones. There's a lot of them that are applied. First one is scale. And
So is that only for WebKit browsers?
I just use the WebKit directives, but for the other browsers that support it, Mozilla and so forth, there are directives for that as well.
Okay.
IE9,
Yeah.
some.
Okay.
You should just have, ideally, you should just have to provide the word transform and not have to provide the -WebKit prefix to it. But because it's a proposed standard and not an actual standard yet, the browser manufacturers are using this prefaced approach until it becomes a standard.
Okay.
So in case they implement it, in case the final standard becomes something different, then at least you're not breaking, what you had previously developed.
Okay.
And once it's completely standard, you just use transform. So for some browsers, transform right now might work. Depends on the browser. So for that, that's a real simple one, just scale. I will make it 120% larger when I hover over it. Now you can apply those two together, transition and transform. And then we'll take a second to
It's a lot neater.
come up. Yeah. So, it just gives you different options. You can go crazy with it, of course.
It looks
but
like you did a lot of work to get that.
yeah, I know. And it's just a couple lines of code. It's not a lot of work at all.
That's really cool for the feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a change.
But the thing that it keeps reminding me of is a lot of stuff that were animations and things you were relying on plugins for, like Silverlight and Flash. All of that's becoming part of CSS.
The pain with that one specifically that you just showed is make sure your page isn't reflowing based on that scaling.
Yeah, when it scales out.
Wraps them.
And this one is just the transform, which is to move it from where it's at to a specified location. And then applying the transition, then it takes a second for it to transform. So you start to get some real movement in
Make sure
it.
you don't move it away from your buttons.
I was gonna say, you want to make sure
Yeah.
the information is far enough that it goes away from the mouse so that it's
Yeah.
not covered anymore.
Exactly.
Those little
Never
clever,
put
click here. Yeah.
You gotta change the text to stop touching me.
Yeah.
Do that, though.
And let's see. This one, as you can imagine, is rotate. You can imagine what that's going to do. But you need to apply some sort of rotation. You see the font goes along with it. It's
Yeah.
really nice. And it's applied to the elements. You can apply that to an image, of course. Or in this case, it's applied to a span. The class is, and everything inside the span.
Specify that to our, Put that on my,
You probably
side
can.
move diagram.
There's a lot of those more
Rotate
advanced
90K.
specified things you can do. Skew, so if rotate wasn't enough. Let's see, we can specify a skew for, just in case you need it for something. You never know.
Makes them think they're falling asleep.
Warp drive.
Okay. So those are your basic transforms.
You can do all of them.
I haven't found a way to do that yet. I actually, because it's specifying the transform attribute, and this one is overriding that one, so it only picks up the last one. At least the way I have it defined.
Okay.
But I bet there may be some way to do it. With animations, you can apply multiple animations,
Okay.
and we'll see that in a minute if I can type it correctly.
Guess we should.
Let's see.
Guess we should have done it in Silverlight.
Okay, so animations. So if transforms weren't enough animation for you, then you can get really crazy with CSS3, and you can define keyframes. And you can say, okay, and define an animation. And I'm going to say this animation is going to take half a second, and this animation is the border shadow animation. So I defined it here. Have 5 keyframes. At 0%, I want it to use all this CSS. At the next one, I want at 25%, this, and so forth, and it scale you through that animation. So let's take a look at that. And this is just a real simple example. And I did the rounded borders and shadows here, but go from something that's really round out to just a little bit round.
So that ignores your transition rule, right?
Probably not.
Well, you have a half a second in one and 1 second.
Oh, I see.
transition.
I don't know. I wonder which one applies. That's a good question. So is it any different if I turn this off? Because it looks like it was taking a second. Maybe the... Let's see. Does it override it or not? Yeah, I guess it was overriding it and using that. That would make sense. It would be more specific than the transition rule. So you can get some subtle little animation effects there. And let's see. Let me comment that one out.
So you can flop out graphics and everything in there.
Yeah, you could do anything you can do in CSS,
Yeah.
you could do with animation. So there are sites where you can actually build a Flash style animation with different vectors and so forth, and it'll give you this. It'll convert it into CSS and give you the CSS for that. So if you want to do graphics and do a cartoon or something, there are tools that'll generate that CSS for you. And I haven't got into that yet, but just looked at that a little bit on some sites, and I think that's kind of where things are headed for those types of animations where you wanted to use Flash before Silverlight. Now you can start to do it with CSS.
Could you modify those or select those in jQuery, those keyframes?
I don't know. How would that? How that would apply in jQuery? How you can do it?
I don't think there's an animation selector in jQuery because it's not actually a class. It's a
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so here's another example animation. Actually, I think I wanted to keep that transform on up here. Just to rotate an image, for example, just one specifying a real simple animation. Here I didn't have any keyframes at all, or just one, the 100% keyframe. But it's going to go from 0 to 100 over 2 seconds. So for some types of styles like this rotate transform, the browser's smart enough to figure out how to do it without you specifying every single keyframe. So you can just specify the 100% keyframe, and we'll see how that works. So refresh the browser here, and if I hover over the image,
Oh, wow.
you see the image rotate. And that was just that one, basically 2 lines. One says apply animation, the other says use a transform.
Oh, so you actually have to hover over the image itself.
That's neat.
See, we should have showed this to the client before we started Moorhead. We could have gotten them all overlaid.
Okay, so let me comment that out. And let's see, grand finale. Here, 2 lines of, this is the last CSS thing, I'm going to try to show you guys. 2 lines of code.
Can you have it over bounce and then come
Yeah.
back?
I should have full screened it. There we go.
That's amazing.
Yeah, with just 2 lines.
So you could have actually created another transform and actually had it go out to 120 and then coming back into 100% with just
Yeah, you could.
keyframes.
Yeah. Yeah, you could specify an easing function to have it go out to 120 and come back in.
So show that. You can have it spinning and moving up and down in place circles.
Yeah, you can potentially apply both of
Come in and rotate around and stop, you know. Like,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, so what if you applied 2 animations there? And let's see, thought about that last night and I was wondering if we could do it. And I think what I was doing was I was taking the hover part of it off. So now we're going to apply this animation to the image and this animation to the span.
So the image is going to
is
spin
in.
while it's going out?
Let's see. Let's see.
Can I see that again? Oh my God.
Now you're just showing off.
And on that note,
And that's just what, just a few lines of CSS, no JavaScript at all to accomplish that.
This is why IE lesson 9 sucks.
Yeah,
yes.
The whole race.
yeah, exactly.
The only reason, yeah.
Okay. So that's our CSS portion. Did want to show you a few other things. We had some questions about. Oh, you want to show it in IE? Let's see. Well, I have IE9. I don't have 10 loaded, but
Should work at 9.
let's see if it at least displays normally. Right? May not have any effects or anything. Okay.
Run ActiveX.
So,
Yeah, that's what it said.
No,
IE9 sucks too.
Yeah,
Well, it is
but I don't have the.
WebKit
You're using
Yeah,
the
I have the
mods.
WebKit directive, so I don't
Oh,
have
that's
the.
right, yeah.
But you're degrading gracefully. You can
Yeah,
say that
that is
at least,
graceful.
Okay, so it's not horrible. Not getting JavaScript errors or anything like that. So that's good stuff. Okay, all right. So a couple other things I want to show. A lot of activity happening with GitHub. Joe just did his GitHub presentation, where we got to see in depth a lot of what Git can do. And I've been using Git for this site as well, and I made some changes to some of these files. So I'm going to commit those changes and show you how simple it is to use Git. Basically, you can see we have checked out. I'm using the Team Explorer plugin for Visual Studio 2012. And over here you can see all the various files that we have checked out. I can go to my solution or whatever level and say, okay, I'm going to commit these changes. And And it's really just as simple as we've been using with Subversion. Say commit.
So that's the
It says,
TFS
hey,
team-
it's committed.
That's the TFS Team Explorer, same
Yeah.
same window?
Yep.
Git, yeah. So you installed the CTP service pack thing?
Yeah, I don't have the very latest one. They came out with an update just a couple days ago
No.
with some bug fixes in it, but I didn't want to jeopardize this presentation, so I didn't do that. Now from here, you should be able to sync with GitHub. Right now, it's just a local Git,
Right.
and but I've been using the training wheel version of Git, which is the Windows Git client, which actually works pretty well. And so here I got my local repositories and my GitHub repositories. So I can go to my local repositories and it shows me I've got, for some reason I don't have this file under control of my, oh, I just added it, that's why. I don't have that file under control. But I'm going to go ahead and add it as well.
That's not the same commit you already did.
No.
So I'm going to commit that to my
TFS
local
is a
Git.
file.
So I can use that for my local Git. It shows me I've got 2 unsynced commits compared to what's on GitHub. And I'm going to show you one other thing too I need to open up. Is I have the whole site hosted on Windows Azure. And I have Windows Azure tied to Git. And I go to my deployments dashboard. And anytime I commit something to Git, it's going to tell Azure, and Azure's going to rebuild my site for me. So the syncing seems to work a lot faster with the Windows client than it does with the Team Explorer plugin for whatever reason. So I just keep using the Windows client for that. And it's nice and graphically real fast and pretty. Okay, that's great. So now it's pushed all of my Git changes out to GitHub. And Azure automatically got an event pushed down to my browser, which was nice, using SignalR or something like that. And now it's building my site. And then in a few minutes, if I had made a change, you guys see here, the site would be rebuilt and have my latest changes out there. So making my changes locally and pushing it out to the site is just a no-brainer. And it's been very, very simple to develop this site that way. One of the other things I've had in place for a while is editing content. And I like using WordPress. It's got a really good HTML editor. So I've got the little edit icon here that takes me out to my WordPress account, and then I can go and edit content. And update that on WordPress, and then I'm reading the RSS feed on my website. So Azure is actually out there, has access to WordPress. It's pulling the RSS over, and then I can redisplay it here. So I can apply the CSS to the HTML and the RSS, and obviously, you know, the styles are vastly different between you know, that whatever CSS is applied with this template and I have on the site here. But it just makes it really, really easy to go in for those pages that I have under WordPress control and go in and make changes to them, and even have stuff, you know, more advanced stuff, JavaScript or things like that on the WordPress side. So it gives me some content management and a really nice, easy way to edit the HTML, and just maybe 2 lines of code to read the RSS, parse it, display it. Sweet. Okay. So I think we covered everything, hopefully. If you have any questions or anything, thank you.